Hello everyone. I know it's been a while, but I can finally record again. So, the previous two videos of mine covered Marx's theory of the economy. I also want to do other stuff, so I'm branching out a bit. The main question I'm going to answer in this video is how do states develop and how do they function? This is quite central to the Marxist theory of history, as well as the strategies Marxist movements should employ. Unlike the other videos, this one represents my own views on the subject as much as the views of other theorists. So expect some revision. I welcome civil discussion with me in my comments. I think only by having a discourse about theory can we actually improve upon it. The main books I draw the theory from for this video are the Communist Manifesto, Lenin, State and Revolution, which is a pretty good summary of Marx and Engels' views on communism, and Tadeusz, specifically the chapter Theory of Force, and Kautsky, The Road to Power. So, with the long intro out of the way, let's begin. Let's start by asking the question, what even is a state? If we look at human history, disproportionate power was always held by a few people, exploiting the majority. The exploited are obviously not happy about this, and they outnumber the exploiters by quite a bit. So a number of systems needed to be constructed in order to protect this minority of exploiters from the majority. In Marxist terminology, the state simply refers to the sum of institutions preserving those class relations. States are made necessary by the existence of exploiters and an exploited class. There's also the specific term of special bodies of armed men. Basically, those are institutions of class rule that seek to fight against a popular uprising. Whether it's the Greek citizen militia suppressing a slave revolt, the feudal army suppressing a peasant uprising, or the police force union busting, the fundamental principle is the same. Violent uprising by the populace is attempted to be crushed by superior force. States also employ some degree of welfare. This is mostly aimed to keep the population content enough so they don't outright rise up. Both of those systems aren't productive in themselves. You can't be a member of the police force and simultaneously bring income. Welfare obviously also needs income to be maintained. So both of those systems require a source of funding for them. And who provides this funding? The classes with the largest income, meaning the exploiting classes. The state obviously runs into a problem when those upper classes don't support them. The threat of withholding this income required for the functioning of the state limits the state. The state isn't a neutral entity, it is dependent on this economic basis in order to have power. Whether it's a feudal lord withholding tribute or a capitalist threatening to take business elsewhere. Ultimately, the relationship is the same. This position is called historical materialism, the idea that rather than being driven by ideas, history is driven by economic development. Many Marxist theorists give the impression that the state is only controlled by a single exploiting class, and class conflict is solely between them and the exploited. History isn't quite that binary. States are just as often an arena of class conflict between upper classes and often attempt to reconcile different classes. The feudal state, for example, had two major classes, the feudal nobility and the merchants, with the merchant houses being often just as influential as nobility. There was a consistent power struggle of merchants against the nobility in the feudal system, just as much as nobility and merchants struggled against the power of the lower classes. This power vacuum of merchants against the nobility enabled absolute monarchies. In case you are about to object that this is ancient history, the nobility wasn't abolished until the early 20th century. So we have pretty long transition between feudalism and capitalism in which the nobility still continued to exist as an upper class. However, within this transitionary period, the increasing power of the bourgeoisie, of capitalists led to increased demands for political power, leading to the liberal revolutions. In those liberal revolutions, universal suffrage was used to motivate the lower classes to side with the bourgeoisie. But as the case of Cromwell shows, this promise was just as often abandoned as soon as the bourgeoisie came to power. Those liberal revolutions during the 19th century were pretty unsuccessful. The French Revolution lasted for about 10 years. The Second French Republic lasted from 1848 to 1849. The German Liberal Revolution didn't even manage to establish a constitutional monarchy. However, those liberal revolutions had one effect. They scared at the monarchy. Faced with the growing influence and the growing unrest of the bourgeoisie, monarchs attempted a solution. They ultimately established some form of constitutional monarchies. A constitutional monarchy enfranchised both the nobility and the bourgeoisie at the cost of peasantry and workers. This was either done through income requirements for voting or having the votes be weighted by income, effectively through the taxes paid. The nobility met those requirements through their agricultural income, while the bourgeoisie met those requirements through industrial profit. Both of them were represented in parliament. Workers and peasants had either no representation or significantly reduced representation, which led to the nobility and bourgeoisie effectively suppressing their political power within parliament. Constitutional monarchy was somewhat stable. It lasted for 5 to 7 decades, depending on where exactly you look. It managed to reduce class antagonisms of nobility and capitalists to the extent that neither of those classes attempted a revolution. Democracy, liberal democracy specifically, was quite a rare thing before 1900. The only major nations to be democratic were France and the United States of America. On the other hand, the United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and many other nations had a constitutional monarchy. So if both the nobility and the bourgeoisie were happy with this system, why did it fail? First up, I must correct a popular misconception. Universal suffrage is not the preferred voting method of the bourgeoisie due to universal suffrage actually giving the worker influence. To quote Rosa Luxemburg, in Germany, meaning the German Empire, the only truly democratic institution, universal suffrage, is not a conquest won by bourgeois liberalism. Universal suffrage in Germany was an instrument for the fusion of small states. It's only in this sense that it has any importance for the development of the German bourgeoisie, which is otherwise quite satisfied with the semi-feudal constitutional monarchy. In Russia, capitalism prospered for a long time under the regime of Oriental despotism, without having the bourgeoisie manifest the least desire in the world to introduce democracy. So, if the bourgeoisie doesn't actually like democracy that much, why did nations transition to democracy? The answer lies with World War I. The first modern war required mass mobilization. This gave a large part of the working class military training and the equipment to use them. Additionally, Bolshevik revolution in Russia made many other nations worry that they might have a communist uprising at home. The liberal state attempts to reconcile worker and capitalist interests through parliament and universal suffrage. Shortly after World War I, nearly all nations liberalized, seeking to prevent a communist uprising. Additionally, social democracy received some institutional support in order to keep the current system. In this sense, social democracy can be viewed as somewhat similar to constitutional monarchy. However, the problem with this is that worker and capitalist interests are directly opposed, so this reconciliation can only be a temporary truce. And, well, the gains made under social democracy for the working class were destroyed under neoliberalism. What was the goal of communist movements? The end goal of communism was a stateless and classless society. Here, Marx shows his roots as a student of Hegel. The state is made necessary by the contradiction between exploiting class and exploited. If you abolish classes, you don't need a state, since there's no one to rule over. This, of course, doesn't mean there's no organization of society. It simply means there's no organization aimed at dominating a certain portion of society. So how does the socialist transformation look like? Well, to quote Lenin, State and Revolution, it takes the form of a direct democracy, also known as council republic, the replacement of the army by militias, and the equalization of wage. In case you're somewhat incredulous, I'm going to quote a bit of Lenin, State and Revolution here. On the issue of democracy, Engels refers quite clearly and definitely to the period after the state has taken possession of the means of production in the name of whole society, that is, after the socialist revolution. We all know that the political form of the state at this time is the most complete democracy. Against this transformation of the state and the organs, a state from servants of society into masters of society, an inevitable transformation in all previous states the commune used, two infallible means. In the first place, it filled all posts administrative, judicial, and educational by election on the basis of universal suffrage of all concerned, subject to recall at any time by the electors. This is a quote of Engels, quoted by Lenin, which I now quoted. But you will find that Lenin agrees with Engels on this issue. On the issue of armies, this in turn results the fact that at a certain stage in the development of democracy, it first welds together the class that wages war, wages a revolutionary struggle against capitalism, the proletariat, and to substitute them for a more democratic state machine, but a state machine nevertheless, in the shape of armed workers who proceed to form a militia involving the entire population. On the issue of wages, in this connection, the following measures of the commune, emphasized by Marx, are particularly noteworthy: the abolition of all representation allowances, of all monetary privileges to officials, the reduction of the remuneration of all servants of the state to the level of workmen's wages. This shows more clearly than anything else the turn from bourgeois to proletarian democracy. So, I'm quoting Lenin here not because his thoughts were particularly original on the subject. He admits as much in State and Revolution, but mainly because much of communist theory is derived from reading secondary sources, which under Stalin had a bit of a political bias, to put it lightly. But yeah, the term dictatorship of the proletariat was originally meant to mean the suppression of capitalists by the entire working class, and it was meant to be a rather temporary affair. Okay, how do we reach that from current society? Well, liberal democracy is best conceived of as a struggle between capitalist and worker. The capitalists require disproportionate influence to offset universal suffrage, and currently they are dominant. I linked a couple of studies in the description which track policy changes and how well they correlate with the preferences of specific income groups, in case you don't take my word for it or are somewhat doubtful of my claim. Okay, how do capitalists control society? I see three major avenues: traditional media, lobbyism, and the requirements of parliament. However, the working class is not powerless within the system. Mass movements and social media can significantly shift the political landscape. I mean, just look at the American conversation regarding healthcare prior and after Sanders. So I think one of those traditional vectors, traditional media, which has large capital requirements and therefore biases the political perspectives, is already waning in importance. But what else can we do to increase working class influence? I think there are three major goals: the direct democratic vote on policy, which basically cuts out the middleman and thereby prevents lobbyism, since you can't effectively bribe an entire population; state support for the establishment of cooperatives; and strong restrictions against lobbyism. I think co-ops are especially important since they offer an economic basis for proletarian power. They offer the possibility of an emancipated proletariat having income and thereby being able to lobby politicians. Unions can merely react to increased capitalist demands and merely roll back legislation. Co-ops can actively support progress towards communist society. Okay, now to the part where I criticize Leninism and Maoism a bit. While many Leninists claim that they have the one true theory, that they are the only successful socialist movements, there's a problem with their argumentation. Their revolutions only occurred in colonial or backwards societies. Those obviously lack the capitalist development required for socialism. When you attempt to fully transform society immediately, and you require a pretty desperate population if you only use violent means. Through the dogma of violent revolution, Leninist and Maoist movements faced a chicken and egg dilemma. The capitalist economy could not be overcome without gaining power, and power could not be gained while the capitalist economy existed. And well, waiting for a spontaneous revolution in the West didn't quite work out. I think transitionary steps and transitionary stages both ease the transformation and lower the threat of losing all progress at once, either through a counter-revolution or a dictator. And those transitionary steps can greatly improve public support, since they offer the public an immediate goal that can be achieved. This also gives spontaneous protests direction, since they can work towards a specific goal. Working outside of parliament and within parliament must be combined, rather than trying to organize only for a violent revolution. Well, I can't see the future, but from where I'm standing, violent revolution isn't going to be happening in the next couple of decades. So we should focus on working within the system to undermine it. Okay, so that concludes my criticism. And one final piece of advice: knowing Marxist theory is something I find to be very important, but knowing when to revise it and knowing its historical context is even more important. We can't blindly follow old texts. Marx, Lenin, Luxemburg, and other thinkers were not divine beings which shaped reality with their words. They were describing reality. If we are to have any success at overcoming capitalism, we need to be able to criticize, revise, and change theory that is wrong. That concludes the video. The video on Luxemburgism is going to be out soon-ish. Have a nice day, everyone.